significant work is known as Gorboduc. Gorboduc. And it is a brutal tragedy in that written by a couple of students and performed at the Inner Temple of the university. But what was significant about it is that Queen Elizabeth was in attendance. And because of that, she had kind of control. There's a great deal of control over what could and couldn't be performed. And I think it was around 1570, she declared that no works of a political or religious nature could be performed anymore. And if you remember back to when we were talking about the medieval cycle plays, that included the cycles of these sort of morality plays that we just read. So that took a few years for that to fully take effect, but eventually by the mid-1570s, there really aren't any more any more church-related, non-secular performances being performed. And the significance of Gorboduc and her being in attendance was that she now became a fan of theater and authorized its expanse. So the nature of this, and again, following the fact that we're studying the classics, follows the Senecan 5-act structure. Seneca, the Roman tragedian, who believed in including things like magic or some element of the mystical. You will certainly see that when you read Dr. Faustus. The storyline, kind of significantly enough, is that Gorboduc the king dies and doesn't leave a clear, actually leaves a notion that the fortunes should be split between his two sons, rather than following the rule of primogeniture, where the first son would get it all. So the first son, Ferrex, I believe, gets all jealous and upset of the fact that this fortune is split. The brothers end up squabbling, end up killing each other in violent, horrible, awful, horrific ways. But this also has a little bit of cleverness to it, because Queen Elizabeth does not have an heir. And so it's sort of almost a fable that's meant to kind of promote the notion of please leave specific instructions behind, or else there's trouble of brewing.
At that time, she didn't have.
She never did.
She never did.
She was a virgin queen.
So this all becomes, as I said, a movement towards a big artistic rebirth. This is kind of the heyday of the beginning of a lot of English oil painters, as they start to kind of, actually that's a little bit more later on, but you start to get more and more kind of expanse of artistry. And again, what these people are studying are the Greeks, the Romans, and the language of Latin as a language. This is a very verbal society. The use of rhetoric and words is highly valued. Now, I'll tell you a little more about Dr. Faustus later on. That's quite evident in Dr. Faustus. We're still, even though education is expanding, 85% of the people do not have the ability to read. So literacy is rare. And that means, as I think I described to you a little while ago, the beginning of Act 3 of Dr. Faustus is an extremely extensive passage about the nature of what's going on in Rome. And again, that's because these people, they see the same hills, the same streets, the same trees every day for the most part. Travel is rare. So this is a way of sparking their imagination, and because they don't have the ability to read, verbally is how their imagination gets sparked. So the spoken word that you will read off the page is what is essential. So with tooling with the experimenting of dramatic expression, what that kind of means and refers to is the fact that we're still, as I referred to earlier, we're taking the structures of these guys and creating a more socially targeted relevance to them. And the notion of I as a human being have some significance in this world rather than I am just a cog and a subject of somebody else who has significance. So this is a general movement of the Enlightenment, of the scientific discovery that is starting to eke its way, not sweep, but permeate its way little by little across all of the nature of the Western civilization. So, as I kind of just stated there, that's kind of what the nature of what we have here. So, the works of Terence and Plautus and Seneca, particularly the Romans, because their writings were more available, but this also did include some Aristotle and Sophocles and so forth. Taking the English stories and familiar legends and kind of placing them in the structure that these playwrights presented. You see a lot of these kind of borrowed character types that we've seen before, especially in Brothers Menachmus, for example. And these plays all follow the 5-act structure. That was pretty specific until we get outside of England and go to France, where each play has 5 acts to it. Now that didn't necessarily mean that there was always an intermission after every act, but oftentimes we are talking about people that have to stand and watch things, and these plays would sometimes go on for 4.5 hours, because they generally had a bit more, I'll call it, there wasn't as much of a rush of urgency as there is in performing today. So even if you took, Macbeth is his shortest tragedy, and it generally, if you just perform it straight through today, it's going to run somewhere around 100 minutes or so. Usually that would be closer to 2.5 hours. Okay? Okay, so in the unity of time and place refers kind of to what we were looking at with Shakuntala, the fact that the acts themselves would represent a time and place of recognition that could be sort of tied together easily. So there are several significant playwrights here. These three, along with Christopher Marlowe, who wrote Dr. Faustus, were known as the university wits. And these are kind of the trendsetters, the first significant playwrights that really start to be performed throughout London mostly, and in the countryside. We'll get a little bit more into the procedures for how things are performed and presented in a minute. Thomas Kyd was, along with Marlowe, one of the guys who was credited for really bringing a significance of structure to blank verse. If you recall, in what we just read, there was a rhyming scheme. Most everything up until the mid-15th century did have to be rhymed to be considered viable literature. But that is rather limited. So as you read through Dr. Faustus, hopefully you'll notice that he's using the blank verse, which does not rhyme, to expand the imagery and expand the potential of the language. So he and Thomas Kyd, not the first ones to do it, but they were largely referred to as the ones that were sort of expertise. John Lilly wrote mostly for aristocratic boys' troops. What this meant early on, and particularly Elizabeth's reign, an aristocrat would like to have its own company. So we'd kind of collect and acquire a troupe of boys to perform, mostly comedies, and they were meant for private, invited audiences. Again, not dissimilar to the way that things were run in Roman times, as far as the patriarchs who put on these plays. But these were largely much more kind of lighter fare, romances, and Robert Greene was particularly known for his fantasy and adventure plays that were kind of wildly inclusive of legends and lore throughout England. So these guys are largely the trend setters for the playwrights. Then we get to
Peach Fuzz.
He is interesting fellow, that Christopher Marlowe. You don't necessarily need to write all this
He
down.
grew up 14 years old and never
So he was born in Canterbury, which is about 70 miles outside of London, I think.
How many kilometers?
Super, that would be 96, I believe.
Nice.
Matt.
Super duper smart fellow in that he earned both master's and bachelor's degrees well into his mid-teenage years. He was like 15, 16 when he earned all of these degrees. He was allegedly studying for a clerical career when he disappeared for several years. Nope, wasn't in jail. Allegedly, he was spying on the French because he could speak many languages, and Queen Elizabeth and her court needed someone